For decades, Cliff Richard was seen as the smiling face of British pop music, a man whose songs defined generations and whose charm seemed untouchable. But behind the bright lights and chart success lay private sorrows, broken relationships, and public betrayals that nearly destroyed him. What began as a story of triumph slowly turned into one of the most painful sagas in the history of British entertainment. Today, we retrace the steps of Cliff Richard, the victories, the heartbreak, and the moment that forced him into the shadows. From India to Britain, and the birth of Cliff Richard. Cliff Richard did not begin life in London, as many of his fans assumed. He was born Harry Roger Webb in Lucknow during the final years of British India. His earliest memories were of warmth and comfort under the Asian sun, but history soon tore that world apart. As unrest spread and the push for independence grew louder, the Webb family packed their belongings and boarded a crowded ship back to England. The long voyage brought them not to luxury, but to a country still scarred by war, where rationing was harsh and opportunities scarce. In a small home in Hertfordshire, Harry learned quickly that comfort was gone. The contrast between what he had known as a child and what he faced in post-war Britain left a deep mark. Out of that dislocation came a fierce desire to prove himself. Music became his escape. American rock and roll, with the raw electricity of Elvis Presley and the wildfire of Little Richard, hit him like a revelation. He began to dream not of fitting into his new surroundings, but of standing out. By his late teens, Harry Webb no longer existed. He re-emerged as Cliff Richard, a name chosen to project strength and permanence while nodding to the energy of his musical heroes. Alongside his backing group, first called the Drifters and later the Shadows, he recorded a debut single that would change everything. Move It. Unlike the polite pop of the time, it was sharp, rough-edged, and unapologetically rebellious. Within weeks, Cliff was hailed as Britain's first true rock and roll star. The reaction was overwhelming. Teenage hysteria swept the country, with fans fainting and screaming in scenes the nation had only ever heard about from Elvis concerts in America. Almost overnight, Cliff Richard was no longer just another young singer. He was the face of a cultural shift, the one who had brought a dangerous new sound to British soil. And for the first time, the UK had a rock idol of its own, a star who chose faith over fame. The 1960s were years when rebellion was celebrated and pop idols were expected to live on the edge. Cliff Richard, however, made a decision that stunned almost everyone who admired him. At the height of his fame, he stood before thousands at a massive gathering led by American evangelist Billy Graham and publicly declared himself a Christian. It wasn't a quiet choice whispered to family or close friends. It was a declaration broadcast across the country. Fans were left in disbelief. The man they had seen as Britain's answer to Elvis suddenly seemed to be turning his back on the very image that had made him a star. Record executives and agents panicked, whispering that his career was finished. Some thought he would walk away from music entirely and become a schoolteacher. Cliff himself considered it. He feared he could not reconcile faith and the stage, believing one life had to be sacrificed for the other. But in the end, he did something no one expected. He stayed. He refused to abandon either calling. Instead, he merged the two, becoming the first major British pop star to openly live by his beliefs while still competing on the charts. That choice didn't just save his career. It changed him. Cliff later admitted that much of his early swagger had been an act, a mask hiding deep insecurity. After embracing his faith, he said his confidence grew. The pressure to always play a role disappeared, and for the first time, he felt free to be himself. This transformation came with a heavy personal cost. The sudden death of his father when Cliff was only 21 left him responsible for his mother and sisters. Years later, he would endure a long, painful vigil as his mother slipped away to Alzheimer's. These experiences deepened his sense of duty, but they also meant sacrificing his personal happiness. Relationships faltered, One with a dancer he truly cared for ended in a heartbreaking letter where he confessed he had to choose career and family over marriage. Other romances with actresses and dancers were short-lived, often undone by his growing fame and the responsibilities he carried. Yet despite the personal sacrifices, Cliff held firm. While the Beatles and other groups stormed the world, Cliff endured by being true to himself. He was no longer just a pop idol. He had become a man defined as much by his faith and resilience as by his music. The love that never was. Among all the fleeting romances in Cliff Richard's life, one story overshadowed the rest, a love that slipped away before it ever had a chance to begin. In the early 1970s, Cliff invited a young Australian singer named Olivia Newton-John onto his television show. From the moment they performed together, there was an undeniable chemistry. Their voices blended seamlessly, their friendship blossomed, and for Cliff, something deeper began to grow. But Olivia's heart was already elsewhere. She was in a complicated relationship with Bruce Welch, Cliff's own bandmate from the Shadows. Their affair was turbulent from the beginning, clouded by the fact that Bruce was still married when it began. For 5 years they remained engaged, yet marriage never came. When Olivia finally left him, Bruce spiraled into depression and even self-harm, unable to bear the loss. Through it all, Cliff remained silent, caught between his loyalty to a friend and his unspoken love for Olivia. In his autobiography decades later, Cliff finally admitted what he had carried privately for years. He was in love with her, but by the time he realized it, his chance had already passed. He chose not to interfere, not to betray his bandmate, even though his own heart broke in silence. It was the kind of sacrifice that left a permanent scar. Despite this painful chapter, Cliff and Olivia never drifted apart. They continued to sing together for more than 40 years, recording the duet Suddenly for the film Xanadu, and performing classics in concert halls across the world. Cliff often said that Olivia had a kind of grace no one else could match. Their final duet came during his 75th birthday concerts at the Royal Albert Hall when they sang Suddenly, one last time. Neither of them could have known it would be their farewell on stage. Weeks before Olivia's death in 2022, Cliff called her. She sounded cheerful, her voice warm and full of life, hiding the pain of her long battle with cancer. Cliff later wrote that he never imagined that phone call would be their last. When she passed, he refused to use the word death. Instead, he said she had simply stopped living. For him, it was the only way to describe the silence she left behind. This unfulfilled love story became one of the quiet tragedies of Cliff Richard's life. While he filled stadiums with music, his personal world carried an emptiness that no audience could see. Collapse and reinvention. By the mid-1970s, Cliff Richard's career seemed to be fading. For the first time since his debut, he went an entire year without placing a single song in the charts. To many, it looked like his time was over. Younger acts were dominating the stage, and Cliff, once the rebellious face of rock and roll, appeared outdated in a world that had moved on. But just when critics were ready to write his obituary, he returned with something no one expected. In 1976, Cliff released Devil Woman, a dark, hard-edged song about curses and strange encounters. It was a sharp departure from the wholesome image people associated with him. The track roared into the charts, climbing into the top 10 in both Britain and America, and went on to sell more than 2 million copies. Suddenly, Cliff was no longer dismissed as yesterday's news. He was embraced by a new generation of listeners, even by some of rock's most respected names. Legends like Jimmy Page, Eric Clapton, and Elton John were spotted wearing badges supporting his comeback album. A music critic even compared the record to the best work of Marvin Gaye. This was not just a hit single. It was a rebirth. Cliff had successfully shed the teen idol label and reintroduced himself as a serious artist. Over the next decade, he continued to adapt. Albums like Always Guaranteed showed that he could craft modern pop without sounding dated. The record went platinum, spawning multiple hits and proving he could still compete in a marketplace filled with younger stars. Then came Christmas of 1988, when Cliff recorded Mistletoe and Wine. What began as a simple holiday song turned into a phenomenon, shooting to #1 and staying there for weeks. It became the year's best-selling single and has since earned platinum status, continuing to bring in royalties every holiday season. By the late 1980s, Cliff was once again a chart-topping force. The momentum carried into 1989 when he marked the release of his 100th single by inviting thousands of fans to a special performance at the London Palladium. He asked them to vote on what song he should release, giving his audience a direct hand in shaping his career. The result was another major hit, one that reaffirmed his connection with the public. Later that year, he filled Wembley Stadium with a show called The Event, which celebrated both his beginnings in the 1950s and his new successes. The concert was filmed, released worldwide, and became a landmark moment, showing that Cliff Richard wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. By the close of the decade, Cliff had achieved what no other British artist had managed: #1 singles across 5 consecutive decades. From the 1950s through the 1990s, he had remained a constant presence in music, a feat that placed him in a league of his own. What had looked like a collapse in the mid-70s had transformed into one of the most remarkable comebacks in British music history, the song the industry rejected. By the late 1990s, Cliff Richard had already proven himself a survivor. Yet the music industry seemed determined to push him aside. When he released the Millennium Prayer, a simple but powerful idea that set the Lord's Prayer to the tune of Auld Lang Syne, the reaction from radio stations was brutal. BBC Radio refused to put it on their playlists. Executives claimed it wasn't relevant for younger audiences, even while artists of the same generation, like Tina Turner and Cher, were still getting airplay. Some DJs even mocked the song, calling Cliff outdated and too old for the charts. To many artists, that would have been the end. Without radio, without major label backing, a single had little chance of success, but Cliff's fans refused to accept defeat. They rallied behind him, buying copies in droves, spreading the word, and turning the single into a movement. Against all expectations, the record climbed straight to #1 and stayed there for 3 weeks. It was Cliff's 14th UK #1, arriving 40 years after his very first. The success went beyond Britain. In Australia and New Zealand, the song hit #2. Across Europe, it broke into the top 20, with several countries awarding platinum certifications. All of this without the machine of the music industry, without the support of radio, and without the promotional campaigns younger artists relied on. The Millennium Prayer became more than a song. It was a protest. It was proof that Cliff Richard was still loved, and that the public, not the gatekeepers, would decide who mattered. By this point, Cliff's legacy was already unparalleled. He had sold over 250 million records worldwide, collected honors including a knighthood and an OBE, and earned recognition not just for his music, but for his charity work. He had raised money for children's causes, spoken publicly about faith, and remained a constant figure in British culture. Yet even with all those achievements, the sting of rejection from the very industry he had helped build left its mark. The Millennium Prayer was his victory over that rejection, a reminder that resilience could still silence doubt. The raid that broke a legend. In 2014, Cliff Richard was at home in Portugal when he switched on the television and saw something that made his blood run cold. Live images showed helicopters circling above his house in Berkshire, while police officers searched through his belongings. It looked like a burglary, but it was far worse. The raid had been organized by South Yorkshire Police and broadcast in real time by the BBC, who had been tipped off in advance. For Cliff, it was a nightmare made public. The allegation was shocking. A man claimed Cliff had assaulted him during a Billy Graham rally in the mid-1980s. But as the details emerged, the story quickly collapsed. The accuser described a room at the stadium where the alleged incident had taken place, but that room hadn't even existed at the time. Officers who had been assigned to guard Cliff during the event were never interviewed, despite being able to confirm he was never alone. For nearly 2 years, police pursued an investigation that produced no evidence, spending hundreds of thousands of pounds of taxpayer money while Cliff's name was dragged across headlines worldwide. The impact on him was devastating. Once a man who filled Wembley Stadium, he now barely left his house. He lost weight, suffered from shingles, and struggled with insomnia. He described his home as feeling contaminated, no longer a safe place. Everyday activities, releasing albums, promoting books, even social appearances, were put on hold. The BBC made matters worse by entering their raid coverage into an awards competition while the case was still ongoing. It was a humiliating reminder that his suffering had been treated as entertainment. Eventually, prosecutors announced that no charges would be brought against him. For Cliff, that was not enough. The official wording, "insufficient evidence," left him furious. He wanted the truth spelled out, that there was no evidence at all. Still, in 2018, he finally found justice in a different way. The High Court ruled in his favor, declaring that his right to privacy had been violated in a sensationalist and unlawful way. He was awarded damages, and the ruling forced a change in how the British press could cover unproven allegations in the future. But no amount of money or legal victories could undo the scars. Cliff himself said he felt smeared, not by the police, but by the BBC. Even after being cleared, he struggled with the fear that people would always wonder. His career and reputation, built over 60 years, had been reduced in the public eye to a raid, a rumor, and a media circus. It was the darkest chapter of his life, one he would never fully escape. Cliff Richard's story is one of dazzling triumphs and devastating trials. A man who gave his life to music, only to find himself betrayed by the very institutions that once celebrated him. Through love lost, faith tested, and reputation nearly destroyed, he survived with resilience that few could match. Do you believe Cliff Richard deserved better from the media? Comment yes or no below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more, and share it with others who want to uncover the hidden truths behind music's biggest legends.